Hello, everybody. Welcome back to #FindThePioneer Talk Show. And I am your host, Jesse Forrester. As always, it's a pleasure to be with you. And we have an amazing speaker for today. If you notice, during the Find the Pioneer series, we've talked about different categories. We started with health with Helena, food with Felix, and energy with Dr. Picard. Now we're going into water. And I'd just like to say bon dia, salam alaikum, habari gani, bonjour, to all our members watching from all over the world. Today we're going to be talking to Ms. Betsy Otto, the Water Initiative Director for the World Resources Institute, a truly international research organization with a presence in over 60 countries. Welcome, Betsy.
Thank you so much, Jesse. Great to be with you.
It's great to have you. Now, let's get straight to it, Betsy. So can you begin telling us more about the Water Resources Institute? I gave a little bit of a prelude, but we could go into that, and the objectives of its global water program, which you lead.
Yes, of course. So World Resources Institute, we're a global research organization. We work in over 50 countries around the world. We're doing quite a bit of work in Africa. As I was mentioning to you, our regional office is actually based in Addis Ababa, and we have folks working in Nairobi as well, where you are. And we work at the nexus, the intersection of the environment and economic development and human well-being, and trying to protect all three of those and grow them in concert, grow them together. And we work in sort of urgent thematic areas that include sustainable cities, climate change, energy. We're doing a lot of work around trying to bring better access to energy in poorer areas around the world. And then we also work on food and forests and water, the global program that I direct, and we have a program on ocean as well, on the ocean. And so, as I said, we're a research organization. We do work on the ground, but we're really trying to look for the evidence base of what works well to address the challenges that we face in trying to grow and develop more sustainably around the world.
Yeah, that does make sense. I mean, science is definitely the most objective point and what we can rely on as data to improve our world. But so currently we're facing a pandemic, right? So closure of Europe and high-income countries in peacetime might be unprecedented, but the war against preventable diseases such as COVID-19, cholera, polio, measles, and Ebola has long been raging for the 3 billion people who lack basic hand-washing facilities in their homes. What are bigger underlying issues related to clean water scarcity that may be driving this situation and future day zero crises in cities and rural areas? And for our audience, day zero was the day that the Cape Town Municipal Council was about to shut down the taps and people are about to lose access to water just because of water scarcity. So it is a major issue. Betsy, please enlighten us more.
Yeah, it's a really interesting moment, a terrible moment in many ways in time around the world. I'm a lot older than you are, Jesse, and I have never in my life experienced anything like this, where everyone in the world is aware of some of the same issues. They may be experiencing them very different if they're more affluent, if they live in a more developed country than if they live in a slum area, let's say, in South Asia. But everyone is they have a heightened awareness. It's brought into stark relief. Whether you have access to water to wash your hands. We know that the first line of defense, for example, against the coronavirus and the COVID-19 disease is hand washing. But, if you are a family of 5, let's say in Mumbai, in India, you might need to do that properly and wash your hands as often and as long as we're being told to prevent the disease just from spreading within your own family. You might need as much as 100 additional liters of water a day. Well, most households don't even receive half of that already. Where are they going to get that extra, those extra resources? In places where they don't have access to piped water, in cities, in rural areas, it's just not possible. Or if it is possible to get it from, let's say, tankers or water cellars, it might cost, many times. We've done research that shows that, if you buy water from a tanker, if you live in an informal settlement, as compared to the cost of water through a pipe system, it can be as much as 50 times more expensive. That's just out of reach for, you know, most households, especially those who are poorer. But you raise a really important point. We're all aware right now, because of the coronavirus, of that issue, right? Which is a really good thing. I think it's heightened everyone's acknowledgement of how important it is to provide basic access to safe water and sanitation. But these issues have been going on for a long time already. You listed a whole bunch of diseases, many of which, you know, require good hygiene to protect against their spread. Ebola would be a great example of that. 1.6 billion people die every year. Let me get that number correct. That didn't sound right when I said it. 1.6 million. That's still a lot of people. Deaths occur every year from diarrheal diseases. That comes from lack of water for proper hygiene, or, you know, poor water sources in the first place that have, you know, different pathogens in the water that are not clean. So we're experiencing this all the time. And you talked about day zero. You know, the poor face day zero in many places every single day. So we need to face up to this challenge and figure out, what are we going to do differently about this? How do we address the immediate concerns, but how do we also look at the underlying challenges that have been there all along?
I think what has really struck me, just as you're speaking, is that statement that you said, that the poor face day zero every single day.
Yeah.
And I never really thought about it like that. And, you know, water to many people is a privilege, and we don't really consider those people that are underserved. So in that vein, then, what are some of the immediate solutions being implemented to increase water supplies and access to sanitation amenities?
Well, there are a number of them. In Rwanda, for example, where maybe only 5 to 10% of the population has access to piped water, they've set up at taxi stands and other places where people used to congregate. Now, of course, they're in more of a lockdown situation, but they've set up hand washing stations. They've been doing the same in areas in India, in informal settlements. So that's just the immediate thing. How do we find ways to bring water to people so that they can wash their hands and they can get access for that? That's an immediate issue. There's some examples in more rural areas that were very successful, have been very successful during Ebola outbreaks, where you create these very simple buckets with a spigot. You have chlorine in the water, and people can wash their hands, and the water that drains off their hands is actually saved and reused in the same system. And you can create, even in very rural, very poor areas, these systems that can create chlorine out of salt and car batteries and water. Now, it's not, you know, as simple as I'm making it sound, but it's very doable, and it's been very successful. So those are some strategies. In Kenya, for example, the government has helped to do cost share for putting rainwater storage tanks at households and businesses and schools. So 1,000-liter storage tanks. And it's very interesting. The Guardian wrote a story about the fact that in areas in Kenya which would otherwise have been really stressed by coronavirus, they have enough water because they're already capturing rainwater, and they can use that for hand washing. So there are things like that that are already in place that, if we scaled them up significantly, could help in the very immediate term. But then we also have to address the fact that we don't have enough access to basic safe water, sanitation, and hygiene facilities at the household level, or in informal settlements that are extremely dense, where it'd be difficult to have piped water systems, at least, you know, initially. There are ways to set up water kiosks and sanitation areas that, on a more decentralized basis, you know this from the work that you've done with Living Machine. There are other strategies that can be used at relatively low cost. There are subsidies that governments can provide for those systems so that they're affordable for the poor, and they're not having to pay 50 times what actually wealthier people pay for in cities with piped water, buying it from tankers and so on. So those are just a few of the immediate strategies. There's some underlying root causes that we also need to address of water scarcity and water challenges, but we can talk about that.
Yeah, it actually seems that you've kind of preempted the next question I was going to ask you. More in terms of the long-term impact, because we know lack of access to clean water for hand washing is actually an immediate concern. As you mentioned, I live in Nairobi, and I have actually seen tanks being put in place, and right now we have rains coming in, and it's very good to see water capture, rain capture being put in as a solution which I think is very good in mobilizing the community to actually take charge. And people have actually been so careful about what they do. But there are also long-term impacts of poor and vulnerable people that arise from the lack of adequate clean water. Would you speak more to that?
There are, and I think not always well appreciated how those, the lack of access to water can not only affect very immediately families, let's say small farmers or people who live in informal settlements in cities, but it can have a cascading effect actually across generations. The World Bank did a really interesting study a couple of years ago, which showed what those effects are. If there's a drought, if there's a lack of water in a given year, a woman in particular who then has a child who will be malnourished, will be less educated, will be typically less prosperous, her child will also be less prosperous, likely, less likely to be well educated, more susceptible to domestic violence and other kinds of challenges. This has actually been documented. So there's a sort of, it sets off a cascade of issues when we're not addressing these concerns, right? And so there's a kind of a hidden cost to water scarcity and a lack of adequate or good governance and management of water resources. And that's certainly also true in urban settings, in informal settlements and really across a lot of the global south. As much as 60 or more %, maybe as much as 80% of jobs are in the informal sector. They're sort of small businesses. They're not, these folks aren't necessarily even being paid in any kind of a salaried way or what have you. We're seeing that right now. We're seeing what the dangers of that all being shut down. More than 250 million people at immediate risk now, really serious risk of hunger across the developing world.
That's true.
So those enterprises, if they can't get access to water, you can't even have a little roadside food stand if you don't have any water to make your food, to wash your hands, to provide, you can't run a small restaurant, you can't run a small business. Almost everything requires some water. So in places where there's a day zero, that actually kind of shuts down your ability to make a livelihood too. So it's not, it's small farmers for sure. They're really affected, right? If the rains don't come, but it cascades all the way through society.
Wow. I really, it's very interesting when you see how much water is the cornerstone of society. And especially here, as you said, in the global south, water is 2/3 of the world is supposed to experience water scarcity by 2025. And, this situation is really exasperating issues. And, we're very fortunate here in Kenya that the rains have come, because initially people were saying, I can't stay at home because I would starve. So I have to go to work. And so this whole sheltering in place or social distancing was not a thing. And I do hope that, as the rains come and food production picks up, that can actually make sense for us to move forward. But you're right, Betsy. We need to actually think about how it impacts generational wealth and the way people come out from such a situation when it comes down to water, because that's going to be the most valuable commodity, and it needs to be, a right and not just a privilege for people to access. I think that's really great work that the World Resources Institute is doing, and through your leadership for the water category.
Well, thank you.
So, welcome. It's really amazing, Betsy. I think for me, it just highlights and underscores the issue. As you mentioned, I'm working a lot in water scarcity and thinking about what it looks like for construction and how it can be more sustainable in our practices. So seeing that there are more people thinking about this on a global level is very encouraging for the work that we are trying to do. So demand for water and for domestic use has grown by 600%. 600% over the past 50 years. So I have two questions for you based on that statistic. What kind of innovative solutions and partnerships can enable economies and populations to continue to grow without exasperating water stress? So let me just repeat that again. Oh, you got the question.
I did. I think, yeah. Stop me if I didn't get it right, but it's a really good question. And, here's the thing. We have the same amount of water on the planet as we've had since the planet began, whenever that was. It changes its form over time, right? Maybe at times it's more in ice or it's more in salt water, what have you. So I guess the point is we have to manage what we have effectively. You know, in the same way that we need to manage to a household budget, how much income do you have coming in? What are your expenses? And you have to try to match those. We have not been doing that with water. We've been acting as if fresh water, it's an inexhaustible resource, and that whoever grabs more of it first is going to be more prosperous. That's sort of been the status quo. And that is not going to work any longer. We've seen in developed countries that you can actually continue to have economic growth and even reduce your per capita water demand. You really have to, right? If you're going to have population growth, if you're going to have economic growth, and you've got the same amount of water, you're going to have, something's going to have to change in that equation. You're going to have to use it more efficiently. And we can do that. Right now, absolutely domestic water use is increasing on a percentage basis, although it's from a very small base. Still around the world, 70% of total water withdrawals are for agriculture. And that's good. We need to grow food. In many places, we need to irrigate crops so that we can grow more food. That's not a bad thing. But how much we grow and where we grow what is something we should pay more attention to. Can we do that more efficiently so that more water is available to cities, more water is available to generate electricity where it's still needed for thermal cooling and so on. More water can be used by businesses and industry and so on. So, you know, back to your question of what can we do differently? Well, there are a number of things. First of all, we have to even understand how much water we have and how much demand we have for that available water. So one thing that WRI created over the last 10 years is a global tool that's totally open source. Anyone can use it, called Aqueduct. And it allows you to look at 15,000 catchments or watersheds all over the world. So it's quite granular. And it looks at long-term averages of how much demand there's been by sector for water. And over the long term, how much water has been available, surface and groundwater together. So it's
incredible.
Yeah, it's the best available source of comparable data like that anywhere in the world. Thousands of companies are using it to understand where they may face water-related risks. And we're now starting to work with governments. For example, in Ethiopia, we're working with the government there with some local data sets to better understand where do they face these choke points, where there's increasing demand. And Ethiopia is going through a lot of economic development, rapid growth, which is good, pulling people out of poverty, increasing, you know, standard of living, but that requires more water. And they need to understand where are those places where the water is, and are they actually talking about increasing irrigated agriculture and industrial processing, and there's going to be population growth in cities, and are those going to collide? And if they are, how are we going to figure out how to allocate the water across those different uses? So that's what you need to do first. You need to understand what you've got, and then you need to allocate it more effectively. And then we just need to use it more efficiently. There are many, many strategies that can be used. Some of them are just very simple with growing crops with just rain-fed agriculture, things that you can do with soil and vegetation and different agronomic processes to make sure you get more yield for every drop of rain. The same with irrigation. There's, you know, very inefficient flood irrigation in use in many places. Even if you just do spray irrigation or drip irrigation, certainly you can grow far more with far less water.
True.
You know, in cities, we use water once and then we discharge it instead of recycling it and reusing it. We could do that. Interestingly, in your continent, in Namibia, they've been doing that for 30 plus years in Windhoek. So it's a very efficient way of managing the water that you have. Essentially, the water I'm using right now in Washington, D.C. was redischarged upstream into the Potomac River many times by others. Why not just create a closed loop system for doing that, you know, within your own city? So those are just some examples of strategies that need to be put in place. Codes for buildings. You know, you've been talking about the living machine idea. It's very easy to actually create these sort of closed loop systems within buildings and require that. Have governments require that those are the, you know, anything that's built in a city anywhere in water-stressed areas in India and Africa and so on, has to do, for example, rooftop rainwater capture. That water can be used to run cooling systems, certainly for irrigation for plants and so on. It can flush toilets. You're not then drawing off of the potable water system. You're creating a much better use of existing water. I could go on, but that's enough.
No, I think that's good, because we have to think really intelligently about what kind of sort of precedents that we have set and how the paradigm needs to shift. And there's been a constant ongoing discussion, and every speaker that has come before has said, you know, if we come out of COVID-19 pandemic thinking the same way, then we've really failed the test. And as much as particularly water in this sense was used for sanitation and such, it's also really important to, as you mentioned, recognize where that comes from in terms of structural inequality and inequity, and how to actually make that become a thing when you're looking at water. It's interesting because the Zayed Sustainability Prize is located in Abu Dhabi, and you know there's a real concern for water. And I managed, when I won in 2019, there was during the Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week, I saw how people were using modern methods for farming in container farms, using aquaponics and hydroponics as a system, and how much more efficient that is for that particular environment. And I think also important thing to bear in mind is how different demographics are. You mentioned Namibia. So for many people that don't know, Namibia is very dry and it's very hot. And so they have to think about how they use their water. So we can definitely borrow a leaf from all of these different countries that are way ahead of us in terms of managing our water in a more sustainable manner. So my second question, based off the statistic of water for domestic use growing by 600%, is so you talked about partnerships between government. You talked about building codes. So can you again provide a little bit more depth about the smart water policies that drive public and private investment towards more sustainable water infrastructure solutions? Dr. Bertrand Piccard was saying yesterday that unless we figure out a way to make solutions or sustainable solutions financially viable, then there'll always be that resistance for us to take it on. And so this is, I think, echoing that same sentiment. What can we do?
Yeah, I think government needs to step up and acknowledge that it's not okay to be where we are now, where so many billions of people don't have access to basic water services, and make it it's one of the very important components of the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 6. It's been the centerpiece of that, access to water and sanitation, since the earlier Millennium Development Goals. It's easy for me to say that. It's a little more challenging to figure out, well, how do you get there? But I think what we need to do is begin from a perspective not necessarily of creating large centralized water utility systems. Those are important. But how can we start from the ground up, especially in informal settlement areas, which is where about 1 in 3 people live in the global south in cities anyway, right? That's where most of the population is that's underserved. And figure out there are strategies that we know in the water and sanitation community can work very well in those places. Bring in local businesses, SMEs, that can actually help to construct those systems, but then can continue to manage and operate them and create revenue streams from them that make them self-sustaining. So there's some examples of this in Madagascar and Antananarivo. Setting up water kiosks and sanitation areas allowed them actually to bring in laundry businesses and others that are sort of based around those areas. And it generated something like $2 million in additional wages for people on an ongoing basis. Wow. And that money actually can be used to continue to maintain and operate those systems, right? Yeah. There's actually more energy value in, I'll say it, feces, in sewage, right? Along with other organic wastes, because they create methane biogas. That can be captured and reused, either put into canisters that restaurants can use as liquid natural gas, or can be used actually to operate plants to treat water. So there's actually more energy value in sewage than is required to treat it. There's an excess that can then be sold. And there are businesses that can be designed to actually do that. You know a lot of this already, Jesse. Maybe some of the folks listening won't know it as well. So, I mean, I think government needs to step up. They need to provide some, and you know, multilateral development banks and others that provide overseas development assistance need to really, you know, do a step change, a 10x kind of increase in funding for that. But it's how we do it too that becomes really important. How we're building local capacity, local businesses, and so on. That's the first step. Another policy that's really important and that doesn't get enough attention, both in cities and in rural areas, is to protect the natural ecosystems that are the wellspring of our clean water. We don't tend to think about this, but this has been a huge issue, for example, in sprawling areas in India. As sprawl occurs, we cover over the natural groundwater recharge areas where rainfall hits the ground and then percolates into aquifers that are then used as water supplies. We cover them over with concrete, and they can no longer serve that function. We encroach on streams and lakes and so on that are kind of the lungs and kidneys and the circulatory system, if you will, of the body that, you know, there's the ecosystem that gives us our water, right? And so we have to stop doing that. We have to at least acknowledge where those areas are and direct development and growth around them. It's way more expensive, though countries are having to do it, to go back in and take that out and try to recreate those systems. Also, forested watersheds that are near cities. We need to create systems of payments for people not to cut those down, those trees, or to go back in and do restoration of those areas. And I'll give you an example that's been incredibly successful in Ethiopia, in the northwest, in the Tigray province, and you might know this story. 30 years ago, it had been completely denuded, the landscape. People had cut down most of the trees for wood fire for stoves, charcoal, etc. It had turned into a moonscape, essentially. It was incredibly dry. It had become even more arid than it would naturally be because they'd taken away all the forest cover. And gradually, the community decided by itself to go in and reforest. They planted trees. They created these stone pits where when rainfall, you know, occurred, it would actually percolate into the ground. And they have restored Tigray to a point now where people migrate into the province. Usually people are migrating out, right? They migrate in because it's been so successful. And the number one advantage of what they've done there, well, I would say it's the number one, is that they've increased the water table. So before, where there was no water, because of all those things that they've done in restoring the landscape, they actually now have really abundant fresh water. Wells that didn't used to run now run freely downstream and in the upstream areas. So those activities, first of all, those are generally less skilled jobs. So you can put people into them that don't have a lot of training. And so there's a lot that we can do around that creates jobs and that actually helps us with our ecosystems. And then the last thing is codes and regulations. So when we build buildings, we should be using low water using fixtures. We should be doing rainwater harvesting, all those things that you know we've talked about. And then we should be doing much more recycling of water and wastewater systems. We know those things work. Governments can ask or require that of new building developers, and it makes a huge difference in cities. Yeah.
That's so true. And I think what you're basically also saying is, aside from the policies for protection, these also give opportunities for job creation, which I think is a major thing in the global south for sure. And as a population is set to grow exponentially, I'm not too sure now with COVID-19, but still, you know, for example, Africa is the youngest continent and is set to have more and more people, 4.4 billion in 2100. And obviously thinking about what that means, because I see it sort of like that domino effect where the whole community benefits as a result of these people doing these jobs. And I like that you mentioned the whole issue about sewage. And when most people think about feces and waste, they don't really see sort of a market opportunity there. But the work we did with the Living Machine actually included a biodigester. And ours wasn't too much sewage, but food waste. And the school would waste about 100 kgs plus of food every single day. And so we put that into a biogas digester, and then it produced gas for cooking. And we actually, as you said, created a closed loop system. And I think that is a way that the future is actually going to look like. I keep saying that, the global South can't develop the same way that the West did, because, now we have access to, great research tools. We know that resources are not infinite, and the world and the earth has actually started complaining. I like the analogy, which I've called a metaphor that you used, about the earth having those systems as lungs, and we're actually killing it if we don't think about how well and sustainably we're using our environment. So many experts are claiming for an extension to the timeline of the SDGs. You had mentioned that SDG number 6 is about water and sanitation because of this pandemic, which many argue is derailing the progress that was being made in achieving certain goals, such as economic growth and eliminating hunger. So based off that, do you agree that the timeline should be moved forward due to the pandemic's secondary effects on communities? And if so, can you explain how you see COVID-19 hindering progress towards the goal of universal access to clean water, among other goals? It's a bit of a loaded question.
No, it is, and I appreciate that. No, I'll just say it at the outset. Sorry, I'm getting some feedback. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. I don't agree with that perspective. I think we should press ahead even harder. I think that this moment in time in this world is making clear as starkly as ever about the inequalities. And by the way, it's not just in the global South and in the developing world. We have communities here in the United States where people are losing their access to water. They're having water shutoffs because they can't pay their bills. And that's been going on for a while, and it's become a bit of a crisis. Now, a lot of elected leaders are stepping in and saying, no, there won't be any shutoffs for a period of time. But it's just really shining the spotlight everywhere in the world on these challenges, on hunger, on inequality, inequities in income and so on. And I think it's time to really step up to the challenge, but do it in the right way too. I don't think, just as you were saying before, Jesse, we can't do this in a business as usual way. In the same way that in energy, the answer anymore isn't to build new coal-fired power plants, right? There's a whole different way of doing these things. And we've been talking about some examples of that can be done in a decentralized, distributed, kind of community-led way, which isn't just some nice-to-do thing that sounds lovely. It's actually smarter, cheaper, more effective, and more equitable.
Yes.
So we'll get to the goals that we're trying to reach if we do that. What I think we should do at this moment is acknowledge that there is going to be across the entire globe in every economy a desire to get the economies moving again, and a real concern about this period of time, however long it might last, this initial period, and then that we may have rounds of this with the virus of economies needing to shut down again if there are outbreaks. I think there's going to be a big push for economic stimulus. And here's the opportunity then. What are we stimulating? And how are we, how are we actually going about that? Can we put the money into SMEs? Can we put it into more of these sustainable strategies? Can we invest now for long-term resilience? Not just rebuilding the old stuff which didn't work in the first place. That's certainly the issue in the global north. And just as you said, we'd be fools to rebuild the systems that didn't work in the global north in the same way in the global south. I mean, one advantage of not having enough infrastructure yet is that you can try to build it the right way from the outset.
Exactly.
And so I think the SDGs can be an animating force for here's what we need to be focused on. Like SDG 6 for fresh water really lays out a good template of here are the things that we need to be paying attention to. Now we just need to go do it and direct resources toward that from the private sector, from the public sector. So now I'm on my soapbox. I'll stop.
No, you're good. No, I think that it's good, and it's actually a really kind of great discussion that we're having, and pressing on is super essential. Because we were even just in the previous discussions, and I'm so privileged to just have to talk to such experts across the globe. We were talking about how climate change was the biggest existential threat to humanity before COVID-19, and it hasn't gone away. And I think just because we've kind of stayed home for a little bit and the world has recovered, doesn't mean that if we restart the economies, it's going to just go away miraculously. And I like what you said, the stimulus packages, and I think the response is to stimulate the older industries. Maybe this could be a chance for, younger sort of startups that are pioneering energy and water and food and health systems to come up and take charge and to actually chart a way forward through this. And so I think it's just been such an engaging discussion, Betsy, and we've got some questions from the audience. So, okay, I don't know if I said that right, asks, actually, no, it's that increasing volume to waterless communities, especially in upland areas, completely changes the lives of people. It touches so many aspects of their daily lives. Time for fetching water is decreased, water-related diseases diminish, new opportunities for growing food, or, was said, water-relatable livelihoods become possible. I think it's just agreeing with what we've been talking about the whole time. And, people looking at ways we can decentralize. I like that message, decentralizing what we have to do and having that as a solution. So I think that we've had an absolute amazing discussion, and I've really learned a lot. And another big takeaway for me is, how can we incentivize communities, just like in Ethiopia, to actually take up their arms and link that with a sort of profit incentive or financial incentive to take care of the environment. And I saw that somewhere else, I don't know if it was in Thailand, where there was a beach that was degrading, and they realized that this was a source of livelihood, and they fixed that. So thank you so much, Betsy. It's been such a pleasure speaking to you once again. And thank you to our audience. Thank you. And thank you to our audience that has just been there for us and listening to the #FindThePioneer talk show series. We would just love to encourage you to apply for the Zayed Sustainability Prize. It is a life-changing thing. And if you have a pioneer in mind, this could be someone that's doing SME work, NGO work, or even a high school that is doing great work with students. Nominate them by sending a message or an email to info@zayedsustainabilityprize.com and help us #FindThePioneer. The extension for the deadline has been moved due to coronavirus, so please do take this time and apply. You never know, you might just be that winner. So looking forward to having more discussions as time goes by. I've been your host, Jesse Forrester, and absolutely stay safe, and we'll see each other very soon. Bye-bye for now.
Thanks, Jesse.